Humans of the cardboard, welcome back to Just Nuts, guys. Today, we're back again with another fun discussion. This time, we're going over another one of my personal favorite archetypes here. These are the easiest ones for me to start with if we're going to make this more of a running series, because I just know the most about them, and I'm always looking at these archetypes, desperately hopeful that eventually Konami comes back around for these archetypes and gives them what they need, and that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about what ZEFRAs need. I've given this a little more thought. I think I did this type of video about a year ago, but I've had more time to think about it. It's a little more fresh in me right now, and yeah, I've got some cool thoughts here. So I've got 4 things that I think Konami can do to save ZEFRA, 4 points that I think they can hit on with support. That doesn't necessarily mean 4 cards, but cards that in some way, shape, or form could potentially cover these 4 areas, as well as 2 no-nos, 2 big old no-nos that we'll talk about at the end as well. So, if you don't know, Zefra is a really cool pendulum archetype. It's my favorite pendulum archetype of all time. It's really the only pendulum archetype I've been able to play in a real, true control fashion. That's usually what you end up doing if you play pure Zefra. Whereas most pendulum decks in the last 5 years are just combo piles, vomit out as many bodies on the field as possible, make big boss monsters, and go from there. That is not what this deck does at all. It's way, way, way cooler than that, way slower than that, which has its benefits, but it also has its minuses as well. So let's talk about those. First thing I want to talk about, first point that I want Konami to hit on, and probably the most important thing for sure, is we need a 1-card Zefra. The deck does not have a 1-card Zefra. Now, there's weird stuff like Super Heavy Samurai Wakushi that is, or Wakaushi, who is a 1-card Zefra, but it's a 1-card Zefra in a bad way. It's not searchable by any of the Zefra spells. It leaves you with Zefra, or with Super Heavy Samurai monsters in scale instead of like actual Zefra monsters, which is much, much worse. And it's just not an actual good setup or reliable enough. And you have to play bricks just to play that engine in the first place. So I would rather get an actual in-archetype 1-card Zefra. And by Zefra, what I'm talking about is 1 card that gets you scales and Zefra in rotation, so that way you can pen summon him out and use his effect to search. The best card I could kind of see for this is some sort of main deck monster, because that card would be searchable off of Zefra, or Oracle of Zefra, and Zefra Providence. So you would have, with Terraforming, 7 extra copies of that card in your deck if it's the single best starter in your deck. So we would already have consistency just by getting 1 card. That would mean 10 copies of a 1-card starter in the deck. That would be so huge. That's one of my biggest gripes about Zefra, is there is no 1-card combo with the pure version. It's basically like you have to have ZEFRAS or a way to ZEFRAS plus a low scale in hand, and that's just the absolute baseline, the most basic of plays. That's what you need just to do anything. And so I'd rather see at least a card that allows you to threaten your opponent with oh, this is his 1-card play, I have to stop this, because then having ZEFRAS and a low scale in hand after that still allows you to do your plays and play through interaction, which just helps with a little bit of resilience in the deck at the same time. So this could come in multiple different forms. I've thought about the theory of a normal summon that's like a Zefra Tour Guide. It summons a Zefra from deck, and so that gets Zefra in rotation, and then maybe there's a Link 2 we get that actually gives us the ability to get scales, and maybe it locks us into Zefras or whatever, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. It could come in many different forms, but some kind of 1-card Zefra pen summon would be so huge, because then it'd allow the rest of the deck to be help support instead of the main line, which would be really, really nice. So that would be huge. That's the first thing for me, is we need, it's going to help with consistency, it's going to help with durability, and it's going to help with power as well. It's going to kind of help in every category, which would be awesome. Next up on the list, we have a way to beat interaction. This deck needs a way to beat interaction. I mentioned how if this deck got its own Super Heavy Samurai Wakushi, that would be crazy. How if it could be a Tour Guide of Wakushi, or a Wakushi type card but for Zefra with maybe some sort of restriction on it, as well as maybe paired with Link 2 kind of scenario. We'll see. But the one thing I really like about the idea of getting its own, our own Zefra Wakushi, would be that Wakushi doesn't take your normal summon. So you could still play other normal summons in your deck, play whatever you want. There's a myriad of different generic normal summons that could work in Zefra and have worked in Zefra. But at least for the deck's, for what the deck is looking for, you could still absolutely, it just helps you play through interaction, right? It's just a card that's going to try to bait something before you try to do anything else, and then you still could have access to scales and then kind of get things going from there. So I love the idea of a card. If it is like a tour guide type card, maybe that's not it. Maybe we need a secondary type of just simple extender that's pretty good as well. We'll see. But like if it's all wrapped in one card, even better. So that's one thing I'd love to see as well. Some sort of accuracy in playing through interaction. Maybe it's another scale, right? Maybe we get like, even if it is the weaker form of whatever we're talking about for the one card Zefra, maybe we get another scale card that's like ZEFRAS, but not quite, just a little bit different, but just another really good scale card that like gets our engine pushed. That way we're not so reliant on ZEFRAS all the time as well. That's another weakness of the deck. That would be huge. Absolutely huge. Number 3. I would love, and I've always said this since I pretty much picked up the deck a couple of years ago, I would love a way to add Zefra cards from grave back to hand. We already have, not Zefra Pilica, is that Zefra Wendy? Zefra Wendy, who can add the monsters from the extra monster zone back, or from the extra deck back to the hand. But we don't have any way to get stuff from grave back to hand. That's actually like a low-key, really important factor here. Because there's like this weird thing in the deck where this deck doesn't set up usually like big boss, like end board monsters. It usually sets up like types of back row, whether it's a floodgate in path or it's one of the traps, whether it's war, divine strike, and technically you play 9 pillars, but that's a Yang Zing card, so that probably doesn't apply here. But at least for divine strike and war, I think one of the biggest things is because they're traps, you don't want to play more than one of either card in your main deck. And so when they're gone, they're gone. So in a slower deck like this, that this is a grindy pendulum deck, having a card, even if it's a one of in your deck, but it's one of those cards where like on the follow-up turn, get it in rotation. Because a lot of turn ones, if you go first, you're getting access to both War and Divine Strike in some way, and firing them if you need to as interruption, and then they're gone. And then if your opponent just kind of holds you off for a turn, you may not be able to set up a lot of interaction if don't get a way to like be able to rotate those back into rotation. So I would love a monster. It's just plain and simple. If this is normal summoned, if this is pendulum summoned, add target a Zefra card engrave and add it back to hand. That would make the grind game so much better. Plus you put a lot of Zefra Providences engraved, and if you never end up using them as like the Balinx effects to protect your board, boom, just get back a Searcher. That's actually quite valuable as well. I think that would be a really nice tool that's not like insane, but it's just like a really useful, really helpful one-of that would definitely see play in any pure Zefra list. That would be sweet. And the last thing I have here for the main deck, there's War and Divine Strike. The last thing I have for the 4 hits that I want to see come to the deck is a Link. And this one's like so like, I guess a Link. But there's a couple of reasons why I think it makes sense. One, they absolutely whiffed with Metaltron. This card like hardly ever saw play. This card came out so early in the Link era, and once we actually started getting good generic Link monsters, this card like immediately got booted out for just like better stuff. This card just didn't hold up. So maybe a Link 2. I think a Link 3 is just asking a lot, especially for an archetype like this that does not spam the field quite as well as other pendulum decks. So maybe a Link 2 would be really, really nice. I also think, and it could do a ton of things. I don't think it needs to be insane. But I also think when we talk about pendulum decks, just inherently, the way that they work with the Master Rule and all that stuff is, basically, for a pendulum deck, in most scenarios, you really want to set up a Link 2 to open up 2 down below zones, and then pen summon 2 monsters from extra. That's the idea. That's usually the best, use of like just making good value on pendulum summoning in a lot of cases. And when you do that, it just kind of feels kind of lame if this deck were to just be like, yeah, just Beyond the Pendulum's fine, I guess. Like just generic pendulum card, or make IP Masquerena and then pen summon under it because it's a good end piece with SP Little Knight nowadays. Like that stuff is fine, but it takes away a little bit of the character of the deck. So I do think for the character of Zefra, and like to give it its own full vibe, why not give it its own Link 2 that it actually wants to make before pen summoning? It doesn't have to be an insane interruption. It could be a slight like engine pusher. Like I said, like paired with a tour guide type normal summon could actually mean that's how you get like full combo or pendulum summon Zefra New. via one card, but and it could lock. It could have some sort of lock if the what it does is a little bit stronger. But doesn't need to be too crazy. I just think that's just how pendulum decks work, right? They make a link monster so that they can pen summon more efficiently, and I think it just makes sense for any archetype that wants to play any kind of pure pendulum wise to have its own link, because it's just going to help give it its own essence, its own vibe, instead of having to rely on generic monsters all the time. But we've seen it with Magispector, we've seen it obviously with Metal Foes. I feel like they could do it here if they put restriction on it. So that's the last thing. Definitely not necessary, but it's one of those things that I think makes sense overall, and also would be cool, and I think could be an easy way to support the archetype if they want it. So those are the 4 things that I want to see. Here's the 2 big no-nos. The first no-no to me is no lore poop. Don't give me no lore poop. I don't want it. What I mean by that is I'm all down for lore support. You guys can probably tell from the channel I never really talk about this stuff too much. I've never really been too big into lore. I don't love archetypes because of how they function in lore or the stories. It's just not my vibe. I just like playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And I like playing archetypes that are cool to me and have a cool style that I like to play. And so I'm all for something being good in lore. But what's the coolest thing? What's even cooler than something being good in lore for an archetype is actually being good and playable in the deck too. Because then in practice, you get to play this story even more so. So even somebody who does care about it more than I do, it not only does it make sense, not only does it complete the story or whatever and round the story out more, but it's actually playable and you get to do it in your hand and it actually be the right call. And you're not just playing it just to have the story in a deck. You're playing because it's actually worth it and good. So no lore poop. Don't make a poopy lore card. This is just an example. I've never played this card in ZEFRA. I just assume it's one of the worst ones. I've played mostly the better ones, and that's not it. And the last one here is be careful of Path. This is the last big no-no here. The one thing about ZEFRA that I think everybody has to acknowledge is Path is one of the most insane floodgates we've ever seen in the game, especially super searchable in an archetype. So I'm basically here to say, if you're going to give this deck an engine push, don't make it too good, or put locks on it that really hard lock it into ZEFRA. That way they can't do too much outside of setup Path and a counter trap or something like that. This is going to be a deck that struggles going second anyway, so I don't think this is going to become some juggernaut competitively. Plus, usually this deck can't fit a ton of non-engine either, because a pendulum deck needs so many scales and stuff, whatever. But I do think it's worth noting, this card is insanely scary. And depending on how much they ever tried to push this engine, if they did, I'd say be a little bit careful, because this card is insane and just straight up auto wins matchups by itself with literally nothing else behind it. And for an archetype that sets up counter traps next to this, that sets up Providence Engraved to protect this, it has its own protection effect built in as well. There's a lot of really annoying layers to how this card can't be outed in a lot of scenarios. So just be careful. Don't overdo it if you ever give this archetype support in the near future, Konami. But that's basically it. Nothing too crazy here. Again, just to reiterate, I don't think this archetype is too far away. I really think even one card, that perfect one card play card that helps make the deck a little bit better at playing through interaction, and then you could make a link monster in there, but I don't even think it's necessary. That may already be enough, that one main deck monster, if it doesn't lock you from stuff and you're still allowed to go into generic extra deck monsters. That could still be more than enough, but it's just worth noting in my opinion. So yeah, really, really cool. One of my favorite decks of all time, one of my favorite decks to play of all time as well. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this one. Where do you guys land on ZEFRA? If you're a big fan of ZEFRA like I am, let me know your thoughts down below. Is there anything else that you feel like specifically in the archetype is missing that you would love to see Konami hit on if they were to give them support in 2024? Love to hear your thoughts on that. I'm out of here for today, though. Let me know in the comment section down below that, as well as what other archetypes you might be interested to hear my thoughts about in terms of if Konami were to give them support, what they should do for them. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on that as well. So I'm out of here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.